Okay, so Rachameem, Chesed or mercy. Bible translators have four choices when they work on a translation. One, they can just do a direct translation, bringing the exact meaning from one language to the other. Two, they can use transliteration, bringing the approximate sound and meaning from one language to the other. Three, they can completely ignore the original words and write nothing at all. Or four, they can use their own words from their own language to change the implied meaning of the message to fit in with your own or your employer's theology. And people say, oh, translators? What employer? Translators work for somebody. They all work for somebody. In the past they've worked at King's, James and a few others. They've worked for lots of different people. Even now they work for the company that's putting out the translation or the denomination that's behind the translation. They work for somebody.
In society as well.
Of course, if you're translating from an existing different language, copying it becomes a much bigger challenge. Especially if you have no knowledge or background or any interest in that original language or culture that it came from. Mercy is just one of those English blanket words that's used to completely alter the original meanings of the original Hebrew writings. Like a lot of things, they use one word to cover actually what is 6 different translations. That word mercy is used 248 times in the Tanakh, or Old Testament. Miles Coverdale was a Catholic friar who unexpectedly became an Anglican friar. Why? Because Henry VIII decided to sack the Pope. But what you've got to remember is that anybody back in those times was actually Catholic. They only just suddenly became Anglican. Henry VIII did a Brexit from Rome. See? It's not the first time. He declared himself the Pope. He did that in 1534, and in 1535 Coverdale published the first complete English Bible in print, which is why it was called the Coverdale Bible. Then, 4 years later, in 1539, he published an officially sanctioned Great Bible. In other words, his employer had told him to do it again his way. So the 1539 became officially called by the king at the time the Great Bible, Henry VIII. But as Coverdale was neither proficient in Hebrew or Greek, he actually used 5 sundry interpreters, and he sourced most of his material from the Latin Vulgate Bible. The Latin Vulgate Bible is the official Catholic Bible. It was translated into Latin by the Catholic Church, and it's still virtually, up until a couple of hundred years ago, was the official Catholic Bible, translated into Latin. In fact, it was the official Catholic Bible for at least 1,000 plus years. He used Latin, English, and Deutsch, or German, as his source text. He used German Bibles, the Latin Vulgate, and some earlier unpublished stuff that was done in English. Tyndale. He also actually invented many words. Why? Because he didn't know what he was talking about, so he invented words. One of his favourite ones was loving kindness. He had no idea what the translation was, so he invented this new word, loving kindness, to replace the Greek word elios, which again was another wrong translation of the original Hebrew word chesed. Chesed has got nothing to do with loving kindness or mercy. It's actually a covenant word. It's to describe covenant. So he used several of Tyndale's unpublished translations of the New Testament. Tyndale had done some translation, but he hadn't actually published. And he used some of his stuff, following Tyndale's November the 1934 Antwerp edition. But Coverdale's 1539 officially sanctioned version was published in London and Paris. And Henry VIII had a Coverdale Bible put into every one of his new English churches. So they ripped out anything Catholic and they put in these new Coverdale Bibles and chained them to the pulpit. They were worried that somebody might try and pinch them. I mean, these things were huge, massive things. And they chained them to the pulpit. Most of the people wouldn't have been interested in pinching them because they couldn't read them. What you've got to understand is back then you wouldn't have understood most of what you looked at because most of it would have just looked like straight German. So these new English churches chained to the bookstands so that every citizen would have access to this non-Catholic Bible. That's what it was all about. They changed it to remove anything that was Catholic. So Coverdale was rewarded by being made Bishop of Exeter from 1553 to 55 under Henry VIII. But of course there was a change of management. And his daughter, Queen Mary, who was Catholic, because her mother was a Spanish Catholic, came to the throne and sacked him. It was a pretty uncertain time in those days. You didn't know from one year to the next. But of course they still weren't Anglicans as we know it now. They say it was part of the Reformation. It wasn't part of the Reformation. Nobody hated Luther more than Henry VIII. And he actually wrote several books against Luther and against this whole Reformation thing. All he wanted to do was to become the new Pope. To him to be in charge and not some guy in Rome or France or wherever else. Because there are often 3 or 4 different pretenders to be Pope in all these different places. Just like the old Roman emperors. They had 5 different Roman emperors in different countries all vying for the title. So it wasn't as straightforward as it seems. Since then, all English versions, including the KJV, which was published in 1611, relied on his translations. Most of their translations were done from the Coverdale, which was done from the Vulgate and done from the German Bibles. None of them were translated from Hebrew. Of course, just to be accurate, it wasn't actually known as the KJV or the authorised version officially until the 1769 version. So in 1611 there wasn't an authorised King James version. It wasn't official till well over 100 years later, when it was made the official version. And James, the current king, gave the translators instructions designed to guarantee that the new version would conform to the ecclesiology of his Church of England. He gave them specific instructions. He hated the Geneva Bible because the Geneva Bible spoke the truth and took away his authority. So he wanted all of that authority put back in there. So again, there's a lot of politics, a lot of changes put in there. So he made sure that it conformed to his Church of England's rules and regulations and his kingship and absolute authority, God-given authority apparently. And so he gave He told them basically that certain Greek and Hebrew words were to be translated in a manner that reflected the traditional usage of the church. That was his exact statement. That any Hebrew or Greek words had to be translated in a way that reflected the traditional usage of the church. For example, old ecclesiastical words such as the word church or circe or circle were to be retained and not to be translated as congregation. And the new translation would reflect and promote the hierarchical episcopal structure of the Church of England, which was government by bishops. The whole of the Church of England was translated based on government by the bishops under the authority of the king. And as I've said many times before, who was classed as the defender of the faith. Henry VIII was given that title by the Pope. Why? Because of what he'd written about Luther. Because he had to go at Luther, the Pope conferred on him the title defender of the faith. The faith he's talking about is the Catholic faith. So this whole thing that they've got now, this the defender of the faith, doesn't actually refer to the Anglican Church anyway. And the interesting thing is apparently Charles wants to be known as the defender of the faiths. All of them. If he actually makes it, which I'm doubtful. So government by bishops and traditional beliefs about the structure of the ordained appointed clergy. Again, you've got to remember that the ordained appointed clergy at the time were usually the second sons of the aristocratic families. The first one went into the army, the second son went into the church. That way they controlled everything. If anybody got out of line, they had the army. If they wanted to guide them, they followed Constantine's example and they used the church to keep everybody in line. So the word they translated as mercy is actually Rachameem in Hebrew, not Chesed, which was the mistaken original word used and used as mercy. Chesed is all about covenant or berith and describes the relationship between Yahweh and man, including the responsibilities and expectations we become subject to when we freely accept redemption. It means steadfastness, faithfulness, unchanging, and it's best understood in the context of marriage, which is a covenant relationship. It's based on mutual acceptance and unconditional free will, rather than a contract based on mistrust and on rules and regulations. Covenant is based on mutual trust, not mutual mistrust. So Chesed encompasses all of the behaviour that's laid out and expected within that covenant. Mutual love, a binding together, free will, forgiveness, loyalty, mercy, goodness, kindness, consistency, compassion, tenderness, and empathy. This is the problem with trying to translate Hebrew words. They're not words, they're concepts. So you have to translate the whole concept, and just taking out one little bit and using it for everything doesn't work. And as we know even from the Hebrew class, it can be done in different ways. It could be the male version, it could be the female version, it could be in one context, it could be in another context. So it's somebody reading that didn't know Hebrew, didn't know Greek, didn't know the culture, wouldn't have had a hope of translating it properly. Which still happens today. All they're doing is translating translations of translations of translations that were wrong from the start. So guess what you finish up with? A mess. And they say, oh, but if you look at the King James and you look at this, not much has changed. That's not a compliment. It hasn't changed because it was wrong from the start. The translation was wrong. It was never translated from Hebrew. Another mistranslation using mercy is kapareth, or cover, which has been deliberately altered to fit a doctrine used by Tyndale and Luther. And that translation was taken from the word Gnadensturm, which means the seat of grace. And they totally replaced the Latin misericords, or mercy seat. So it became the seat of grace and not the mercy seat. And it wasn't the mercy seat because they didn't use the correct translation of the word mercy anyway. So again, a lot of these things have been put in there to fit particular theologies. And it was that particular word, the mercy seat, the seat of grace, was taken as the basis of authority from Yeshua to replace Yom Kippur. And they replaced it with the New Covenant, or will, or New Testament. We call it the Brit Hadashah, the Renewed Covenant, but they called it the New Testament. And that was what they used as the authority to do it. So a bad translation of a bad translation, and we finish up with something that's even worse. So they actually completely replaced the original, irreplaceable covenant. No man can replace a covenant. And even Yahweh, he doesn't replace covenants, he adds to the covenant. It's like the American Constitution. They have different bits that were added in later. It's still the American Constitution, but it's got different parts of it, the different amendments that were put in there. This is the new amendment.
Can I ask, is there any such thing existing as a real, genuine Greek Parashah version, you might say?
No, because most of the Brit Hadashah were translated into Aramaic, translated into Greek, translated into Latin, and they weren't taken from the Hebrew versions. And a lot of the Hebrew versions are actually missing. There was one of the guys, I can't remember who, in Spain, he was put on the spot by the bishops there during the Inquisition, and he actually managed to find a Hebrew translation. I think it wasn't Matthew. It was one of the things anyway. He translated the Hebrew directly into Spanish and blew them away because it was so different from anything they got. So there are scraps around, but in the vaults of the Vatican I think you'll find some of the originals. And in actual fact they've actually found some original Hebrew versions in places, diverse places such as Russia and a few other places. But they're kept under wraps. Most people don't know about them. It's only some of the scholars that have recently discovered them. But,
So sad. So sad.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, they have...
doing the vault in the Vatican anyway.
Oh, they've got air-conditioned...
Yeah,
they've got air-conditioned vaults under there. And they've got so much stuff under there. Because basically, history is written by the conquerors. History is not written by the vanquished. It's written by the conquerors. And the conquerors write what they want to write, and anything that disagrees with that, they bury. They either burn it or bury it. And the Vatican just buried it. Because the Romans...
I think, this is just off the top of my head, I think the fact that you could say we've been hoodwinked, but I think that the fact that we know we have a good God and we know everything about Him is good and we try to emulate that part of it, we're on some kind of safe ground. It's not as if we're being hoodwinked into something nasty.
No.
No. We're on good ground.
Yes.
The best of humanity will come out through Yeshua.
Yes. No matter what.
No matter what. So
that's right.
The words are quite different, and that's not it's a concept that we are on the right track.
Oh, absolutely.
Otherwise, we could actually just walk away from the whole thing.
We're not trying to alter the whole thing. What we're doing is taking out some of the bad parts, translating it into it's like faith. The word faith, it doesn't mean anything to most people, or it means the denomination they're part of. When you translate that to the real meaning of trust, it totally transforms how you view it. So it's just small things like that make the whole thing flow. And it's generally when you're reading something and you look at it and you think, it doesn't seem right, then usually you need the answer to that. But most of the rest of it is fine. When we agree to the terms of a marriage, we agree to a set of conditions of that marriage. Nobody forces them on us. It's a free choice whether to accept those terms or not. And our relationship with Yahweh is the same. It isn't a contract. It's not a mutually negotiated agreement. He lays down the terms of the covenant. And He lays down the relationship terms. And then we've got a free will choice to either accept them or none of them. We can't just come along and say, well, we like that bit, that bit, that bit, and that bit, but we'll scrub that bit out. We either accept all of His terms or none of His terms. Once we've made our free will choice to either accept all of them or none of them, we become completely responsible for our part of that agreement. It's a mutual commitment as equal partners. He gives Himself fully to us, and we're expected to do the same. All of the terms and conditions need to be fully explained to make a free will decision and to be understood. Of course, otherwise the individual covenant that was accepted without all the facts would be invalid, because informed consent would not have been given. But many people today try to function on a casual de facto basis, in non-committed casual relationships. And they also try to put Yahweh in the same category, as an on-again, off-again, believing or not believing, based on Him meeting my needs and making me feel good. That's not the basis of a relationship. We don't go to Him with shopping lists. We don't go on hunger strike to make Him do what we want Him to do. Maybe if I fast for 20 days, He'll have to do it. Not the way it works. It's the complete opposite of a genuine covenant relationship. And what it means is, I'm saved, I'm this, I'm that, and the other. But unless they've agreed to those terms and actually operate within those terms, they're not even betrothed, they're not even engaged to Him, let alone ready to get to come to the marriage supper. And because they're not even betrothed, sadly, they will not be invited to the Nisuin or marriage supper of the Lamb, the covenant bridegroom, unless they repent and accept His terms and His conditions to live according to His guidelines, based on a full and honest, trusting commitment. So mercy or Rachameem is a different term. It brings up a dilemma within the covenant guidelines. Which came first, justice or mercy? And how can a righteous God combine them both? How can you have justice and mercy combined? The answer, of course, is forgiveness. That's the key. Forgiveness of the person, but not the act itself. This is where we get confused. We mix the two together. He forgives the person. He deals with the person. And He deals with the sin separately. The act itself will always have consequences. He chooses grace as the platform to provide the mercy. Because as the judge, he upholds the law, and he dispenses the penalty for breaching it. But in our case, as the father of the accused, us, he's our father, but he's also the judge. He has chosen to pay the full penalty himself through Yeshua, our kinsman redeemer, who's provided a way of reconciliation and restoration of both our character and our behaviour as the forgiven. Providing, of course, that we accept his terms and agree to a full course of rehab. Don't often tell you that when you get redeemed. Not only do you get redeemed, but you automatically go straight into rehab. Some of us are still there. It's the place where we repent and we leave our old way of life behind as a criminal. Whether we accept it or not, before we were redeemed, we were criminals, we were rebels. And as partners in his covenant, we're expected to conform to the same standards of behaviour as Yahweh. We're expected to show grace and unconditional love and forgiveness. We're required to display his character in our everyday lives. And our relationship with Abba, like any other, is a two-way street, which involves giving as well as receiving. Any relationship has to be two-way, or it's not a relationship, it's a dictatorship. It has to be a trusting partnership with our other half, who in this case just happens to be the creator of the universe. As I said before, unless love is unconditional, it's not love. It's not the basis of a real relationship. The dictionary definition of mercy is leniency and compassion shown towards the offenders by the one administering the justice. And it's based on grace or hadis. It is undeserved, it's not a right. It is a decision reflecting the character of the person who chooses to offer it. Yeshua is the truth, the emet, and mercy, Rachameem, embodied in one person. In Matthew 12, Yeshua outlines this concept when he said, I desire loyalty, faithfulness, relationship, grace and mercy. In other words, Rachameem. What he does not require is man-made sacrifices or works or rules and regulations. And he says, in a few days I will seal this berith, this covenant, so do as I say and do as I do. Don't just say as I say and then completely ignore the do. Most people don't like that clause. They love to say what he says, but they don't actually like to do what he did. And that's the key, unless you do. It's just empty words. An out clause is not an option. And he's quoting Hosea 6:6 that says, for what I desire is Rachameem. Not sacrifice, not works. Knowledge or relationship with me above burnt offerings. In other words, sacrifices are the absolute minimum to satisfy justice. But they don't satisfy a chesed or covenant relationship, which is an intimate partnership built on trust. I don't require my children to come and offer me sacrifices. How many of you would turn around to your children and say, okay, 6 o'clock, I expect you to come and bring a sacrifice. But I do expect and cherish their obedience. A conversation with the Perushim, the Pharisees, the forerunners of today's Orthodox rabbis, discusses what is permitted on Shabbat. And it challenges them to understand it in Hosea 6:6. But now, through yet another mangled translation, what it supposedly states is that he's totally changed his mind. And that because he's Lord of Shabbat, we have a license to do anything we like. The whole thing's been twisted around. This technique of taking scripture out of context and twisting it to suit a particular religious agenda has been used for centuries to excuse the replacement of the seventh day or Shabbat, ignoring the truth that He is the creator of Shabbat for man and never has or will replace it. As we well know, there was a Roman Emperor, Constantine, did that 1700 years ago, and decided that the day of worship would be to worship him, the epitome of the sun god. He was the sun god, so Sunday became the day of worship. It was never there to worship God, it was there to worship him. What he's merely doing is challenging the Pharisees to actually enjoy Shabbat. Shabbat is a delight. It's not meant to be a religious observance. It's not meant to be rules and regulations and nitpicking and hardness and, I remember our first pastor, Bill Millwood. His father was a Presbyterian minister. His grandfather was a Presbyterian minister. And if he bounced a ball on a Sunday, he'd get hit. You didn't do anything frivolous on the Sunday. And a lot of people treat Shabbat the same way. You don't do anything frivolous. You don't do this. You don't do that. It's a time of delight. It's a time of joy. We're meant to enjoy it. He gave it to us to enjoy it. Not for it to be a misery. Believe it or not, he's got a sense of humour. I know that every time I look in the mirror. It makes us all different. He's telling the Pharisees to enjoy the freedom of Shabbat and stop these double-standard hypocrites who strain insignificant man-made rules or gnats but ignore or swallow massive Torah camels. They'll strain every little rule and regulation that they've done, but when it comes to things of the Torah, fine. God understands. He doesn't mind. And most people today are swallowing Torah camels. Things that are very important. Meanwhile, they've been told that they've got to come under rules and regulations. You know, the loads that are put onto their shoulders. And yet the people that do it don't lift a single finger to help them carry them. In other words, he wants Chesed principles, not outward shows of seemingly pious, whitewashed behaviour that's actually used to camouflage their true nature. The wolves in sheep's clothing. What he's actually asking them is, where's the love? All the judgment's there. Where's the love? Shabbat is a celebration of creation. It's a family day. It's a time to give thanks and share with joy. It's our weekly appointment to remember all that He's done for us, is still doing for us, and will continue to do for us. And this is the good news that we need to let other people know. And give them free, no strings attached invitations to anyone and everyone, to go out to the highways and byways and bring them in to the festival, to the feast. We need to invite them in. It's a family time. It's a joyful time. They need to come and enjoy it and experience it. But of course, when we give them these invitations, we must warn them that acceptance could be life-changing. It usually is. More people have found God trying to prove that He doesn't exist than anybody else. A lot of scientists are now believers because they spent all of their time writing theses to try and prove that He wasn't real. Fortunately for them, they found out He was real. C.S. Lewis was one of them. He was a philosopher. I find it interesting that I saw something the other day. Somebody's just earned a first-class honours degree from Durham University. Guess what her thesis was? The Cardassians.
Oh no. Tragic.
And now she wants to write a book about it and do a film. But she's just got a first-class honours degree based on the Cardassians.
Oh.
You know, when he says, my wisdom's just a bit higher than your wisdom. It blew me away. Anyway. So Shalom, Baha HaBerith, firstborn of the covenant. Shalom. And next week I'm going to continue this teaching and we're going to explore Berith or covenant.